Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So, hello and welcome to another episode of Security, Intelligence and Terrorism series. Today we have among us Joby Warrick for the second time in our series. He's a renowned journalist who worked with the Washington Post since 1996, mostly writing about Middle East diplomacy, terrorism, and national security. He's a two-time Pulitzer winner and author of 3 books, the recent one being Red Lines, The Unraveling of Syria, which I have a copy here. So thank you so much, Joby, for taking the time and being on the show. It's a pleasure. And I think this is the first Indian interview they're doing for the book.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. It's great to be on this podcast for my first interview in India.
Yeah. So before I start going into the detailed questions about characters in the book that you've written and the content that's there, congratulations to the book. It's a great one. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this one. It almost felt I was watching a thriller and a typical Joby Warrick book where you feel it's too close to it's too close to be a thriller, and it's no borderline difference you can find it in reality. But I'm very fascinated with the name of the book, Red Line. Was this intentional? Why do you choose the name of the book, Red Line?
Yeah, there are two things about the title. Of course, the title itself, Red Line, the phrase has a lot of meaning, particularly in the United States, where the political debate about what to do in Syria hung around these 2 words, red line, these fateful words that President Obama had uttered in 2012, essentially warning Syria, don't use chemical weapons, don't use them against your people, don't move them. And when he did so, when he challenged President Obama, there was considerable criticism against the president for not using military force, and that we get into the reasons in the book. The other part of the title, which is interesting to me, is this part about this most dangerous arsenal in the world, and that sounds like hyperbole, but I was very deliberate in saying it because at the time in 2012 and 2013 there was a huge cache of chemical weapons, a weapon of mass destruction that was vulnerable because it was in a country being torn apart by war. There's certainly bigger arsenals and nuclear warheads in various places, but to have such a large arsenal, so vulnerable, so likely to be stolen by bad actors, including the Islamic State, was as perilous a situation as far as WMD goes as we've faced for a while. And so that was a very deliberate use of that phrase.
Yeah. And Mr. Obama was really criticized for using the phrase because somehow it pushed him to one corner and he had to retaliate at any cost, right?
Yeah, because it did seem in the pressure, political pressure was that, well, you made this promise, you made this threat, and so you have to do something. And Obama later argues that, it's a shame when one has to back away from a commitment or a promise, but sometimes the greater good from a policy point of view is to be flexible and to respond to situations as you feel like is more appropriate. So that was his argument. And what the book does is explains that the red line comment was quite complex in the sense that it was based on real intelligence. The United States was receiving warnings from the intelligence community in 2012 that Syria was indeed about to do something with these weapons. And the implication was that Syria was not necessarily going to use them against its own people, which it did later on, but it was going to give them away, that it was going to provide them to Hezbollah, which is a militia group next door in Lebanon. And because of that threat, you see Obama and also Hillary Clinton and others in the administration going out and warning privately, warning the Russians, warning the Iranians, telling them all to restrict Syria to make sure this terrible event doesn't happen. And Obama comes out 4 times to deliver this message, publicly. And on one occasion, it happens to be at a press conference, someone asks him a question, and his response is the same as don't use these weapons. There's going to be consequences. And in this one time, he used the word red line, which is for us, it's a kind of a strange phrase. It didn't say I'm going to use military force. It just says that this is a pivotal point for us. It means that if you cross the line, there will be consequences that were vague, but political opponents and also other countries wanted to hold him very strictly to his promise to do something, and to many of them, doing something meant military force. And so, yeah, in a way, Obama was in a corner. He felt, I think he personally wanted to respond in a dramatic way to the use of chemical weapons, but there was also this sense that he had committed the country to doing something, and so he was in a political jam diplomatically too.
Yeah. So I'll come to that exact point where he was in a dilemma. Should he be crossing that? Should he personally be retaliating or not? A little later. But let me just ask you this question: that a lot of readers who read this book might be a little fascinated by the term of red line, because since you mentioned earlier that it is a term that's used by President Obama. Does this book and for us journalists, it becomes like we are the only torch bearer of neutrality, and there cannot be anyone else. So let me put this question with neutrality: is this book written from an US-centric point of view? Readers who are trying to read this, because since the name goes like this, or
Yeah.
trying to be, as a journalist, as neutral as possible?
Well, I do feel that I make an attempt to be international in my focus. I know the headlines or the book title doesn't necessarily convey that. From it's always the case when you're marketing a book in a country where you're trying to get people to be interested in the story, particularly American audiences who frankly aren't always interested in foreign subjects. So I try to insert a bit of the American role in this. And obviously America is very important in the story, but it truly is an international story, because this was a moment when the entire world decided to act in Syria, a country that was in this terrible civil war that was spinning out of control. The United Nations seemed helpless to do anything about it. The Russians seemed willing to back up Assad no matter what happened. But over this issue of chemical weapons, you have this brief moment of convergence when everybody decides almost unilaterally or collectively that they're going to respond in a very dramatic, significant way. And so I try to explain the international pieces of that and the different parts of the UN and the EU and Asian countries, others becoming involved in this, both in trying to force Syria to give up its stockpile, but also helping out with trying to eliminate this dangerous stockpile. So you see the Chinese involved. You see, the Russians, the Germans, the Danes, and Scandinavians, and it was really an international response. And unfortunately, it was kind of a mixed success, because it managed to do some things that were good, but as we'll see in the discussion, the main problem, the Syrian war itself, was not resolved, and that conflict continues to this day.
So was there a rallying point between these countries that they came into consensus that this is one red line that shouldn't be crossed? What was Russia's red line, for instance, in the deal?
Right, you're right, and that raises a good point, because different countries had their own red lines here, and for the United States and for we hope the international community, one red line was the chemical weapons taboo. This is one of the only classes of weapons that have been outright banned. That the biological and chemical weapons are not, as far as a community of nations, we've outlawed them. And for chemical weapons, the ban is more than a century old. It comes back from the early days after the First World War, when the whole world was confronted with the horrible specter of chemical weapons being used in battle. So they were illegal, and there was a sense that the world had to enforce this taboo, that these weapons should not be used. They're too indiscriminate, they're too destructive, so let's not use them. But other countries had their own red lines. And for Russia, a red line was the protection of Assad, a very important ally. Syria is the home of the only warm water port for the Russian Navy in the world. It's an important intelligence collection center. And so it wanted to preserve its ally at all costs. The Iranians felt the same way. They were a bit annoyed, I think, at the use of chemical weapons by their friend Assad, but they wanted Assad to remain in power. And so all these countries made their own calculations, and all of them essentially agreed that these chemical weapons are a bad thing. Let's get rid of them. And that's how this whole thing came together.
Yeah. So two questions. The first being the deal, the US-Russia peace proposals on Syria. If you could explain a little bit about the deal. And the deal was made very hastily, and it was signed as well very quickly. Uh, why did US had to sign it so urgently? What was the urgent requirement? And why was Russia trying to protect Assad?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So here you have this moment where this terrible chemical weapons attack has happened in the outskirts of Damascus on the morning of August 21st, 2013. The Syrians launched an artillery barrage using sarin shells. So this is this terrible nerve agent, much more deadly than cyanide. And the result, there's been numerous different estimates of the number of people killed and wounded. The Americans decided it was about 1,400 dead and many more injured in this attack. And so that is this moment where the red line, the American red line, is being tested. Obama, for various reasons, is having trouble getting support for a military strike. And so this opportunity of a deal is floated. And it's a very complicated story. The Israelis are pushing this idea of a deal. Obviously, it's in their benefit if Syria doesn't have a chemical weapons stockpile. The Russians are hinting that they are interested in doing it. And so out of the blue, this thing kind of gels. Putin and Obama discuss it in Geneva at a meeting privately. John Kerry, the Secretary of State, is giving a press conference. He's asked about the weapons, and he says, if Syria will eliminate its entire stockpile, maybe we won't attack Syria. And then as he's flying home that next day, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, calls him on the plane and says, I heard your statement about these chemical weapons and possibly getting rid of them. I think we can make that happen. And within 3 days, the diplomats are on their way to Geneva to put together this really unusual, almost unprecedented arrangement to eliminate a stockpile of another country. Russia and America deciding Syria will no longer have chemical weapons and we're going to get rid of them. And it happened so quickly, in part because I think the Americans were desperate to do something. They wanted some alternative to a military strike, and here was a good alternative. There was also fear that there was a limited window. If we don't do this quickly, if we don't get a Syria to agree now when the leverage is at its maximum, then this deal is going to fall apart, and Syria is going to renege on its promises, and we'll never get this done. Because we remember there are multiple objectives. One, of course, is trying to do something about Syria or responding to this war crime. But the other objective is getting rid of this dangerous stockpile. And that is something that here was an opportunity to do. We can at least do that. And if we have to do it, we have to do it really, really fast. And so the deal was made within days. The UN Security Council gives its blessing with a resolution. The OPCW, this Office of essentially the chemical weapons police force in the world, agrees as well. And so all the pieces come together in a matter of days to try to make this deal work.
Yeah. So you mentioned a lot of interesting stories, and most of these characters are not those if I could use the word headliners, not those typical headliners. They are small characters yet plays very important roles. So if you could share one story, particular story, I'm talking about the story of Eamon, if you could talk about that story a little bit for the audience, not giving too much of it, but let's start from where it all started.
Okay, and talking about the very beginning. And so this is an interesting story because there's a whole controversy, as your viewers will remember, about weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East and bad intelligence. The United States went to war over bad intelligence about a weapons stockpile in Iraq. So in Syria, it's different because in Syria, we have a very, very good idea about exactly what Syria had in its weapons depots. The reason is because the United States had recruited a spy many years before, back in the 1980s. There was a senior scientist who worked for the Syrian government who was inside the complex where these weapons were being made. And he became our star recruit, a mole, if you will, a secret spy inside the labs, giving us information, but also sending us material, sending us actual samples of the sarin that Assad was making. And this stuff comes out to us. We analyze it. We understand exactly what the Syrians are making and how big their network is. And so over about 14 years, the United States, through its CIA, through its intelligence service, ends up putting together a very detailed portrait of this weapons program. And we won't spoil the ending, something really Surprising happens to the spy. His life comes into danger, and we'll just say the CIA's window into the program was very abruptly shut down back around 2002. But because of that spy, when civil war breaks out in Syria many years later, we have a really good idea of what the risks are, because we know that there's this large quantity, about 1,300 tons, it turns out, of chemical weapons in the country. We know where the weapons are located, and there's a real urgency about trying to get rid of them as quickly as we could.
Okay, so the next thing is I wanted to ask you this. I don't know how else to put this. It's a very fast question. Let's put it this way. Where did it all start? The international community that the attention that the international community had gave to Syria. Where did it all start? Did it start from 2011 when the Arab Spring broke out, and it was not Syria when it started from Tunisia and it moved to Syria, and there was demonstration, or was that talking you just spoke about the 2013 incident where there was a dropping in Sarkib? Where did it all start from?
And I don't go into a lot of detail about this in the book, but as early as 2011, within months after the Civil War started, you began to see not just the Americans, but the neighbors become very concerned about the possibility of this stockpile being plundered, being lost, being going missing. The Jordanians are very concerned. They start to organize international groups. They bring in NATO for meetings. The Turks are very concerned. They're worried about a chemical weapons incident that might have blowback for them. There might actually be a chemical weapons plume that travels across the border into Turkish areas. The Israelis become so concerned that they begin handing out gas masks to villages and towns along the border. And so, the rest of the world is very focused on the political uprising, the dramatic scenes in Syria with the demonstrations, these massive protests, the violence that begins. But for the security community, people are laser focused on this chemical weapons problem. And I know that because I was covering it at the time, and there were endless discussions about what to do. And so you'd see the Americans, for example, start to plan, what happens if we feel the chemical weapons stockpiles are under threat? Can we send troops in? Can we send special forces into the country? Can we use bombs? Can we destroy them remotely? And all those scenarios are looked at and carefully considered. And most of them were pretty bad scenarios. You can't, it turns out, send bombs to blow up an arsenal of sarin. If you do that, you're just going to create a cloud that's going to kill more people than you wanted to. The ones you wanted to save might be killed in the process. And so the options are really, really bad. The only thing they could hope for was that if there was a fall of the Assad government, everybody thought that Assad would eventually fall. If that happened, then maybe there'd be a new government in Damascus, and they would negotiate, a deal with the chemical weapons prohibition, folks in The Hague to eliminate the weapons. But that was, by 2013, that was a very, very remote prospect, because by then the war was essentially a quagmire. Assad clearly going anywhere, and yet there were more and more extremist groups becoming involved, not just the citizen soldiers we saw in the beginning, but some very bad actors. And so the danger level just kept going up and up and up.
Yeah. So then it was right after that 2013 incident, it was the United Nations who sent Selstrom, a retired professor, to go and who had an extensive background in chemical warfare, to go and investigate. If you could tell us a little bit about what was he able to achieve. And
Yes.
it was very close when President Obama, as you were talking about the red line that was crossed, and he was trying to respond to the attack, but he couldn't because of because of this personality, Selstrom. If you could tell us what was happening there.
Yeah, it's a fascinating part of the story to me. So you have, before the big attack, before the big chemical weapons attack in August of 2013, there had been a series of really small attacks, sometimes just one person killed or a few people killed. And it was hard to confirm from the outside that these were actually chemical weapons and not something else. It was hard to confirm who was responsible. Had it been, rebels had stolen something, as Assad would claim, or was this the Syrian government doing these attacks? So the UN was under pressure to investigate. They got a team together and sent them into Syria to begin to look at evidence of these attacks, to figure out if sarin or other chemical weapons were indeed being used, who was responsible. There was various restrictions and rules, but there was this opportunity for the UN to investigate. The leader of the group was this professor, a medical professor from Sweden, who had a background in the physiology of chemical weapons and how they affect the body. He was leading this group. He gets to Syria, and the Syrians essentially stonewall him. They tell him, we'll provide evidence to you, but we're not going to let you run around the country and collect the evidence that you're looking for. So they keep negotiating. It doesn't go anywhere. As this man Sellstrom is in Syria, in Damascus, this is when this really terrible attack takes place in the outskirts of town. It's so close that the inspectors can see the attack from their windows. It's about 5 miles away, but they can see the rocket strikes. They can see the smoke plumes on the horizon, and they begin agitating right away for permission to go and investigate this crime, which just happened. But it becomes very complicated because as much as the UN wanted to go and investigate, the Americans wanted to bring these people out, bring the investigators out, because they were in the way, literally, of a military strike. If you have fact finders on the ground, it doesn't look very good if the United States is sending missiles, making a judgment already about who was behind this atrocity. And also, there's a fear that Sellstrom could be held hostage, or he could be made a human shield, or all kinds of terrible things could happen. And so there was a delay of several days when Obama felt he couldn't strike because of the presence of these UN inspectors on the ground. And that ends up contributing to this delay, which eventually causes Obama not to want to strike at all. But it's one of many kind of strange things that happened in those late weeks of August of 2013 that kind of stay Obama's hand. And while he wants to strike, he's forced to slow down and think about it more.
Yeah, but that didn't initial hindrance didn't stop some of the strikes. In fact, I'm referring to in 2016 in an interview where President Assad was interviewed, and he gave this. He was asked about the U.S. military partnership against the militants as outlined in the deal, and he mentioned very nonchalantly that U.S. would never try to attack the ISIS or, in fact, the other groups, because if we do that, it will lose the card for lose the card that's causing this instability in Syria. And this followed attack actually on the, I think, the army, the Syrian troops, and US called it accident, and there was a lot of controversy post that. So, what's your response to this remarks that Mr. President Assad made during that time?
Yeah, it's if you know this part of the world, and I know you've spent a lot of time looking at it as well, there's a love of conspiracy theories. I'll put it that way. That there's this belief by some that the United States was behind ISIS in some way, and we were supporting some of the Islamists, and of course that whole the problem of the growth of these extremist militia groups in Syria is very complicated and very problematic. But the United States did decide eventually to get involved militarily in Syria, but against ISIS, which was viewed as the greater threat. And there were occasions where Syrians were caught in crossfire. I see no evidence that the Americans deliberately targeted Syrian soldiers, because there was a clear desire not to get involved in Syria's war. And by 2015, 2016, the Russians were on the ground as well. And so the United States was being even more careful about military strikes that might affect Russians, because there's a possibility of getting drawn into a larger conflict. And so, these kinds of things do happen in wars. But I have never seen evidence to suggest that the United States deliberately targeted Syrians until later, until after Trump came into office. And in 2017 and 2018, missiles were launched at Syrian chemical weapons facilities and military airports, and some Syrians were killed. So things changed after Trump comes into office.
Yeah, and there was also repeated allegations made on how the Syrian government has been involved in airstrikes on civilians and medical workers. And post that, we have also seen how the UN convoys were being treated. For example, they were not being allowed to enter the city of Aleppo, and this has been continued for very long. If you could tell us what was happening, why was not UN convoys not being allowed to enter cities where they needed medical aids and humanitarian assistance?
Yeah, I think the simple, unfortunate answer is that that aid was weaponized by the regime, and we've seen many cases of this. And I've spoken to the UN officials who were involved in trying to negotiate access. But there was a regular, consistent practice by the Syrians to refuse to allow aid into certain areas as a way of punishing, or as a way to breaking a blockade, or just because those people in that village were on the wrong side. And that's a really disheartening, distressful thing when you see innocent people, women and children, victims of these really terrible decisions, to deny, to deprive them of aid because of political reasons, or because their village is on the wrong side of the conflict. And that continues. I mean, you've seen the politicization of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, SARC, which has again and again has deprived aid to places that were in opposition areas, and not just because of logistical problems, but because they made a calculated decision to deny aid to people who supported the rebels. And so that's been one of the features of the Syrian conflict that's really quite alarming and distressing, and still going on today.
Yeah. And now coming to the humanitarian part, the disaster that happened, where hundreds and thousands of Syrians had to flee the country, and many drowning on the way, and many of them fleeing the country. If the Syrian government, as it mentioned, it's not campaigning against, it's campaigning not violence and not indiscriminating them. So why are people fleeing in thousands? If you could tell us a little bit about how the Syrian refugee crisis, even till date, exists, and how how thousands of people are still in search of a proper settlement.
You can't, I've been to the camps in the border areas, on the Jordanian side and on the Turkish side, and it's hard to get your mind around the scale of human misery in these places, despite really heroic efforts by some of these non-government groups, by the UN, by humanitarian organizations, to create conditions that are at least livable. You see essentially a permanent refugee community that exists on the borders, and also within the border areas, not just in sort of the camps themselves, but you see tens of thousands of Syrians heading into the towns and villages in the border areas, trying to develop a life for themselves. And you get this crazy, the implications, the ripple effect of this refugee wave is just extraordinary. In countries like Jordan, for example, something like 10 to 15% of the entire population of the country is now Syrian refugees, people fleeing the war. There's similar situations in Lebanon and Turkey. And then, of course, this mass wave of immigrants heading north into Europe, which has destabilized governments, which has caused, the rise of some of these populist governments that we've seen come into power, who kind of demonize the refugees and try to make them all into terrorists. So it's been quite disheartening to see, and also it's also amazing to see how this one conflict in this one country has spread instability across the globe. And it makes you wonder now, like, what could we have done? What could we have done differently 10 years ago if we could have anticipated this, to contain this problem and to keep it from becoming so untamable and just from affecting so many others outside the region.
Yeah. If we look for once through the lens of the Syrian government that time, and understand a country is in a full-scale conflict at the moment, and the other countries are forcing it to give up the most powerful weapon it possesses. Isn't it too much to ask for?
That's that's a good point. And actually I've raised this a lot in my discussion with people who criticize Obama, and I will not ever say that Obama does not deserve some criticism for his handling of Syria. I think the administration certainly does, and most fair observers from within the government would say the same thing. But Syria was forced to give up something very precious to them. Syria was punished. Syria did not even acknowledge having a chemical weapons program, and it was their essentially main strategic weapon for use in a war against Israel. They didn't develop it to use against citizens. They developed it to put into side missiles to launch at Israeli cities. And they spent a lot of money and a lot of manpower, brain power, building this program, making it really sophisticated. This was not mustard gas. This was sarin. It was VX. It was the most dangerous chemical weapons that are around. And then they had to open up their country to let foreigners come in and inspect all these facilities and then take all their equipment out, destroy it piece by piece. So not just eliminating the chemicals, but actually destroying their production and manufacturing equipment. And it was embarrassing, humiliating. It was extremely, it was a huge cost blow for them because they had lost something very valuable to them. And so in that sense, yeah, they did give up quite a lot. They didn't have much choice about it. The Russians essentially forced them to go along with this. But it is very much the case that Syria had to part with something extremely precious to them. They didn't get rid of all of it. As we found out later, they managed to hide some of it. Everyone expected they probably would try to do that. But their ability to make new weapons was completely eliminated, at least for the time.
Yeah. So as I was reading through your book, I found this interesting anecdote that, and probably while I completed the entire book, I realized that one of the main thing that's highlighted, and probably you can say is an achievement, that ISIS did not acquire the weapons, is somewhat the main achievement over the last, probably of the Obama administration.
So yeah, it was an achievement, but as you, if I'm anticipating the question, we didn't succeed there either, because ISIS did not steal weapons as far as we can tell, but they stole the idea. And they decided that, wow, yeah, you could really get a lot of attention if you use chemical weapons, so we're going to make our own. And ISIS was in a position because it owned real estate in 2014-15. It had universities and labs and scientists at its disposal. So it crashed a program to make its own chemical weapons in secret. And the book brings out a lot of the details about how they did this and where, how they recruited scientists for the program. But they didn't get very far because that information begins to leak out. The Americans and other forces involved in the anti-ISIS coalition get extremely concerned, and they focus resources on trying to find those scientific labs and stopping them and capturing and killing scientists. So that happens, but not until ISIS has succeeded in making some things. So it did make mustard, which it, as far as we know, has never been made by a terrorist group before, but they manufactured a chemical weapon that they used in battle. So I think it's fortunate that we were able to find those labs and stop them, because they were getting better and their expertise was growing, and they certainly were willing to use these weapons in any way that would help them.
Yeah. So largely the point. So if you could understand, what was US major concern during that time? Was it the ISIS might acquire those chemical weapons, or Assad using those weapons on a citizen? What was the major concern?
So I think countries always think in selfish terms, and that's just the reality of it. There was a lot of concern about humanitarian, the humanitarian toll of chemical weapons attacks. It was something that was revolting to see. It was shocking to us. It was clearly a violation of all the chemical weapons taboos. So we did worry about that. But I do think the Americans were more fixated, more focused on the other problem, because ISIS became, in 2014, it became clear that the Islamic State was an international threat, that it had vast resources, it had to be stopped, and it was worth a commitment of troops on the ground, air force, air power, all these other weapons and tools that we could bring to try to stop ISIS. And one of the big threats that ISIS posed was this chemical weapons threat. It ended up mostly using things it knew how to do, car bombs, suicide attacks. We saw what they did in Europe with bombs at airports and other places. But the possibility of chemical weapons attack it was realized that this could have been a game changer. That if there had been, for example, a chemical weapons attack on the tube in London by ISIS, or in New York, or in New Delhi, or in another major city, it would have been a game changer. It would have essentially compelled the United States to go to war in a major way. And so if that could be stopped, that was an important national security objective as far as the Americans and NATO were concerned.
Yeah. And the Syrian crisis is not coming to an end anytime soon, for sure. So, if summarizing, if you could tell one lesson that we can get from this book, that the Obama administration made a mistake, and the Trump administration made a mistake, and probably the Biden administration can take it forward. One lesson, if you would like to point it out.
I think that there are a couple that come to mind. One that I'll focus on just because it still seems possible. There's so much about Syria that seems impossible to us most of the time. But the issue of accountability is an important issue in this story, because even though Assad, as we discussed, was forced to give up something of value, he was forced to eliminate this weapon stockpile, he was never held accountable. His regime was never held accountable. He was never even required to admit or to acknowledge that he had these weapons, or that he used these weapons to kill his own citizens. There's been no criminal process to bring the perpetrators to justice. And I think it's important for upholding these standards, that this taboo that we try as an international community to pursue justice for Syrian citizens and victims. And that process is moving forward. It's slow. There are trials that are just getting underway in Germany and France. The OPCW, the Chemical Weapons Watchdog in The Hague, has gathered a massive body of evidence, and it's now going through the process of trying to show one by one that these attacks were carried out by Syria, looking at the evidence on the ground. And you could imagine that someday there'll be a procedure at the World Court or in some other tribunal where the people who were behind these attacks could be brought to justice. It takes sometimes many years for this to happen. In the Balkans, it took 20 years for some of the leaders who behind some of the slaughter and the massacre of civilians in Serbia rather, to be brought to justice. So it takes a long time, but it can happen. And I do think that the Biden folks are very aware of this, and they would like to see accountability happen. They're also very aware that they can't allow Syria to idle, that they have to be engaged diplomatically. They have to have skin in the game, as we say, working with the Russians, looking for opportunities to do something about the humanitarian crisis, about the refugees and all these other problems. Because if we don't, Syria will continue to be a failed state. It will have it'd be a vacuum where bad things can happen, where bad groups can come together. So it's an imperative for all countries to be invested in Syria's future in some way.
Yeah. So this is one last question before I have actually a couple of last questions. So this is one question that my viewers really wanted me to ask, and a lot of my friends have like repeatedly asking that you should ask this question to Joby. The question is, how do you go about this vast amount of research? We're going to start a research on a country like Syria, and you're going to start from 2011 and you're concluding at 2020. And which is a very drift from your first book, The Triple Agent, which concludes its episode, whereas The Black Flags and Red Line is a continuous episode, and things happen at times. When you're probably writing it, there might be different updates that are coming out. So how do you go about researching such a vast amount of literature that's out there? Go about interviews? How do you make those small connections and go ahead? If you could just elaborate your process for our viewers. Nobody will copying that probably for that, but if you could just
Yeah, I'm not giving away any secrets that'll cause problems. The great thing about our jobs, and I know you know this too, is over time, the network of people that that will talk to you, the things that you cover and that you know about, expands as you continue to do your work. And so one project builds on another. In a way, this latest book started before Black Flag started, because I was covering the Arab Spring, and I was talking to security people about this chemical weapons problem way back in 2011. So these were all things that were going into my notebook at the time. But what was important, I think, is for me, was to focus. That's always hard to do when you're writing a book, because if it is changing, if there are new events happening all the time, you get distracted, you start to worry that maybe things will change and your book will not be relevant. But I had to make a decision early on about what parts of the story I wanted to tell, and then to try to get as deeply into the details as I could. And then once you have all those details, another difficult decision is what to leave out, because you want to tell a story that makes sense to readers without overwhelming them. Because if we get too deeply into the technical details and this sort of minutia of decision making, it gets to be too much for a reader to digest. So then it becomes an exercise in just focusing on how to tell the story, and often it is through characters. And that's why I like to to do this again and again in my book is to focus on people who were not at the top necessarily. They were not in the sitting next to Obama, but they were on the ground making things happen. And through their experiences, you can explain a much larger, much more complicated set of circumstances in a way that readers can read and say, well, okay, I understand how that happened. I understand the conflicts internally that this person felt, the emotion that they felt about it. And so it feels real to me. And I use those like little, jewels on a strand, connected one after another to kind of to make a very complicated, very difficult story make sense. I hope that makes sense in my explaining.
Yeah. A couple of months back, I was actually talking to a CIA officer, and the person recommended me your book as well. And she's like, you should definitely read Black Flags if you want to know about ISIS. And a lot of people have uh, used your book as a textbook example of how you should report, how you should go about understanding various kind of facets you're talking about. Let me get this exclusive part, probably where you haven't spoken about a lot in other interviews. Is there a particular incident while you were walking in the book, uh, talking to characters that struck with you and changed the way or discourse of your writing this book? Any particular incident or any interaction?
Yeah, that's really good. I think there were several that and it's almost hard to pick one out because just because I'll talk about two if you don't mind. One is there's a Syrian character who I get to know who and forgive me even more. There's an updated version of the book that came out after in 2021 after some additional changes were made, and he's more present in the later version. But he was a Syrian medical student whose life gets turned upside down by the revolution, that he just was trying to finish his medical license. He wanted to practice medicine, and then the uprising takes place, and he ends up having this passionate role in trying to first save lives, particularly of people who were being beaten up during these demonstrations, but also preparing the country for a chemical weapons attack. And what was compelling to me was to get to know this young man and to understand what the war looked like through his eyes, but also to understand how frustrating it was to see the Americans and others not respond to what he thought were compelling reasons to get involved, ways that the Americans and the Europeans and others could have made the war go differently, could have caused a different outcome. So that was eye-opening to me, to really understand the war through his eyes and through people like him. And the other is just to understand people like Tim Blades, who is this American character who shows up in the book, who's an engineer who is kind of given this problem: what do we do with all these chemical weapons if we get our hands on them? And he came up with a solution. He built a machine that could neutralize sarin. He didn't have a place to put the machine. No country in the world wanted to host a chemical weapons destruction facility. So he ended up putting the machines on a boat and selling it out to the Mediterranean and floating around for 40 days, destroying these chemicals one barrel at a time. And to understand how this thing happened sort of in public view, but nobody really got the complexity, the difficulty, the risk, the challenge, the technical challenge, all the things that went into the task of making these weapons disappear. And to understand that through the memories and the thoughts of a person who designed it, it was exhilarating for me. I had never really been able to grasp how big a challenge it was, and to talk to the people that did it and had their lives literally on the line to try to make this process work was exhilarating, and also a privilege to get to talk to people like that.
Yeah. So concluding, I remember last year around the same time when I was contacting you for the interview, you mentioned you writing the book and how so many edits after edits and countless number of edits. And I know how the job is. It's very difficult to actually write a book rather than filing a news report. It's two different experiences. But is it too soon to ask about your next project? Have you decided what you want to work on?
I have not. I have. My typical pattern has been, after finishing something like this, and then there's the writing and the editing, and then there's the publication, promotion, and it's just very, very busy. and then after that you're exhausted. And I still have a day job. I work at the Washington Post, so I still have a very demanding job as well. And I feel like I need time just to unplug for a while. And it's funny how ideas come to you just as you're relaxing, as you're walking your dog, or you're doing some chore around the house, and then suddenly little ideas come, and you start to play with them and ask questions. And so my confidence is that the next idea is probably back here someplace. It's in the conversations that I'm going to have over the next few months. And it's part of the excitement of writing a book is the chase of this idea. And once you have that kernel of an idea that you think might work, it's running it down and testing it and seeing if the story is there, because there's so many elements. It's not just the details, but does it work as a narrative? I mean, because the stories I want to tell, I'm not writing a policy book. I want to have a middle of a beginning, a middle, and an end, and some sense of resolution or some larger conclusion. So it takes a while to really find the right story to tell. And so, but that's a fun challenge. There's really nothing better than that for me.
Yeah. Well, it's because of the kernel of idea. We have three glorious books, and we can actually munch on those, understand the conflict better, and probably take some time off and not watch a movie and go and get a real book. It's difficult actually with Netflix for young people reading books, and I think it's a great substitute for not of a Marvel movie of superheroes, of villains. And especially what I like about those characters that you mentioned, since you mentioned it's character-driven book, before I end this, there's a great understanding of those characters are all gray characters. They're not black or white. There's no villain or hero in the story, and I think that's a very fascinating read for anyone who wants to know what happened in Syria.
Yeah, there's very little black and white in the world. I find it's always gray.
Yeah. So before I end, so if anybody wants to buy the book, I'll put the link in the description below. Thank you so much, Joby, for taking the time and being on the show. Great hosting you.
A pleasure. It's always great to talk to you, and your interviews are great. I think you have a terrific show. So my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And probably the next time again you host, we're gonna definitely have you. So we're looking forward to it because we get to talk to you only when you write a book. So looking forward to that.
Looking forward to. Thank you, man.
Thank you. Take care.